All right. So again, welcome to this webinar on grant programs for farmers in Wisconsin. And we're going to be covering a lot of grant programs in a short amount of time today. So just a few quick housekeeping details. Please keep yourself muted if you're not actually speaking. We encourage you to type questions into the chat box at any time, but we will wait to answer questions until the end of each presentation, and then we will have a longer question and answer time at the end of the hour. And the presenters have agreed to stay on for up to half an hour after, so up till 1:30. So there'll be plenty of time to ask your questions at the end. For those of you who are new to Zoom, to enter questions into the chat, you can click on the speech bubble icon at the bottom of the screen, and then type your question at the bottom of the column that will appear probably on the right side of the screen. You can adjust what you see on your screen by clicking on the View Options button on the top. For example, when a presenter is showing slides, you can choose to see just the slides, or you can choose to see a small image of the presenter as well. Before we get into all of our presentations, I want to start with a couple of very quick comments to just kind of frame how you see what's going on. And I'm going to quickly share my screen for that. And I'm also going to ask one of my co-hosts to keep an eye on the waiting room while I'm sharing my screen and admit people, because I can't do both at once. So is everyone seeing that? Okay.
Yes.
I'm seeing some heads nodding. Great. So today, just for a quick overview, after I give my first introductory comments, Lisa Kivrist, who is a farmer, will start by sharing some of her experience of applying for grants. And so it's really important to hear the perspective of an applicant as well as the perspective of the program staff, I think. Then we will, in short order, review some of the USDA rural development grants. As I mentioned, I will talk about sustainable agriculture research and education grants, and then we will hear about several grants that our Department of Agriculture administers. And finally, Margaret Crome is not presenting today, but those of you who were able to watch the how to write or how to frame a project video will recognize that name. And Margaret is here to answer questions. So, I'm advancing too fast. So a couple of just really quick comments about when applying for a grant makes sense. The first thing is you have to make sure that the grant's mission aligns with your goals. If it doesn't, you're probably not going to get funded. And even if you tweak your goals enough to get funded, it's probably not worth it to you to do all the work that you promised to do in the grant if it doesn't really meet your goals. Another thing to really keep in mind is the amount of funding and the timing. So there are some grant programs that are wonderful, but they're too small and they wouldn't meet your needs. So, it's probably not worth it for you to apply to those. But probably the more important thing is keep in mind that it takes a long time to hear about these grants. And all grant programs will only cover expenses that have been incurred after the grant is awarded. So you can't say, I have a project, I need to get started on it this winter. I'm going to apply for a grant, and if I get the grant, that'll be great. They can reimburse my costs this winter. So you have to keep that timeline in mind. You need to be eligible to apply, and I think all of our presenters will talk about who can apply and who can't. The chance of getting funded is reasonable, and that's really a question you have to decide. And finally, you have the capacity to deal with the hassle factor. So not only is there the hassle of applying for the grant up front, but even after you're awarded a grant, you have to do reporting. You have to keep track of your finances and let the granting agency know about that. There can be tax implications of getting a grant. So keep all of those things in mind as well. Why is my slide not advancing? Apologies, everyone. I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. Just one other quick comment. The Michael Fields Agricultural Institute has a grants advising program, and we will put the link for that into the chat, and that is a resource that you can access. And so at this point, without taking up any more of our time, I would like to turn it over to Lisa to share what her experience has been applying for grants.
Excellent. Thanks, Diane, for inviting me. And hello, everybody. I am zooming into you from our family's farm in Serendipity Farm outside of Monroe in southern Wisconsin, where things are frosty still, but we do diversified vegetables, and some agritourism enterprises have a bed and breakfast, and have been here now 25 years. So I have been involved with SARE, particularly on the grant side from the Farmer Rancher grants and Youth Educator grants. So we'll speak a little on that. Diane will take you into all of the logistics and the specifics on it, but I'll speak more from a experience in the sense of having been in those trenches of deadlines and applying. And so two specific programs within SARE I've been involved with on the grant side is the Farmer Rancher grants and the Youth Educator grants, both of which have deadlines coming up. So everything I'm going to say will hopefully be applicable to still be able to get ideas and applications in. But one thing that I've always looked at with these that helped me a lot is if there's a problem that I, as a farmer, am struggling with, a barrier, and I think other people, other farmers would have the same barrier, that's a good start for a grant proposal, particularly for Farmer Rancher, because that's what it's intended to fund, is ways for us to collectively and collaboratively solve problems and improve the financial viability of our farms. So rather than the other way around of where is their funding and how can I create a problem or find a problem of mine to fit the fund, it works the other way around of what are some needs of yours. So I'm going to just speak personally because these are clearly my interests and needs, but I've been really passionate about and working in the cottage food space. Many folks are familiar, but these are state-specific laws. We have a little bit of a quirky situation in Wisconsin, but they're laws that allow you to use your home kitchen for producing specific non-hazardous products for public use, public sale, direct to the customer. Great opportunities for farmers to sell like high acid canned items or non-hazardous baked goods. But there's not a lot of resources for farmers in this area. And so some of the Farmer Rancher grants I've worked on have been specifically for canned items, the high acid. How can we package better? How can we market better? I was bringing my pickles to the market, but they looked like the pickles on my shelf in the house. You know, they didn't have that marketing pizzazz of cool labels. So we developed a label toolkit to help with that. And then on the baked side, a lot of the things that I would want to sell, things that use what I have in abundance, zucchini bread, pumpkin muffins, for example, technically are not non-hazardous. They're a little too moist. And could we develop recipes that could allow us to use these things? So I'll put in the chat the website for that project so you can see what some of our results are. But basically, I was hitting these barriers of I didn't have a tested non-hazardous zucchini recipe, and maybe somebody else needed that too. So that's where we start of what's a need that you have, but also, as you might have heard in my voice talking about cottage food, what are you passionate about? What do you really feel interested in? And what do you think other farmers could use these resources for too? Because these grants are a lot of work, they're a long haul, and it needs to be something that really gets you sparked to, I find, at least for myself, to keep going. So identify the need and what are your interests in? And then three kind of tips, if you will, from my experience in writing these grants is first and foremost is just to peck away at them in the sense of an hour a day or whatever time you have over the course of a couple of weeks goes a long way rather than just one full day. And I've done them both ways. And the ones that I've crammed at the last minute that I wrote the weekend before thinking I can get this in still didn't get funded. And in reading them after the fact, they weren't strong. I hadn't thought things through. There were typos. There were little things that, hey, yeah, I didn't put the time into this. But I find that short bursts of time go really well for me because they're big ideas, and to flesh them out, looking at them day to day, new ideas spark new ways to add some things to it, etc. So I find that helps. So bottom line, the earliest you can start, you're here today, especially with the ones with upcoming deadlines, start pecking away at them. And that's where, again, the ideas expand, and I just find they're much more stronger and come together better. Plus, you can take advantage of things like Diane mentioned, the grant review and resources within Michael Field. I've tapped into that. There's folks there who can give your grant a fresh read, which is priceless when it comes to developing your idea. But those things, again, take time, not the day before the deadline, but having some extra time I found really improved what I submitted. My second tip is we're in a really great position as farmers to bring in partnerships and boots in the fields collaborations in these grants, which is really the point of these projects led by farmers, right? So some of them, like farmer ranchers, can be multiple farmers working together as a unit that applies. But even then, organizations that we work with as farmers to bring in as partners in your grant, I think really add a lot and are perspectives we can bring. So anything from, like here in Wisconsin, you're a member of the Wisconsin Farmers Union, or you attend the Marble Seed, formerly Moses Conference, or other organizations that you've worked with, to contact them and be like, hey, I'm doing this grant. Would you be open in me sending something for your newsletter, or writing an article for your publication, or presenting at a conference, etc. That goes a long way in strengthening your application, I find, and it also just builds those partnerships. And those are things that we can really bring in. Sometimes they're almost obvious because we work with these organizations all the time, but it's a legitimate way for an ask that can really enhance applications. And also too, on that partnership note, I find that having the legitimacy of a funded grant opens up a lot of doors for us as farmers to ask questions, in the sense of I'm not just asking a question. Hey, I'm working on this USDA funded project, and can you help me with blank? For example, this cottage food one, I mentioned briefly tested recipes. Let me say, I am not a food scientist or anything like that. This is a totally out of the box thing for me. But because of this project, I could find some context, in this case at the University of Illinois, in their food science division. And hey, could you help me develop these recipes? And because, again, this was a project that I'm working on with other farmers, they're like, sure, this is what we do. So it was a real win-win. But it just helps, I find, to have people return your calls when you're working under these capacities. So there's ways we can expand, I think, the message too of what we're doing by those partnerships and building those collaborations. And the third tip I had was being realistic in timing and deliverables, in the sense of, put it this way, every grant that I've received, I've asked for an extension on. And Sarah's really nice about doing that. But my point is, I am always a little too excited and too eager in what can be done in a time frame. And while enthusiasm is great, reality comes. Asking for an extension is not a big deal, but it's just something to keep in mind when you're writing this, that to be realistic in what can be done in that time frame. And you want to finish it, right? And you want to move on to other things or maybe other grants. So not necessarily want the whole project to go longer than it is, but to be realistic. Things, bottom line, as we all know, but I need reminders, take longer than we think. And so it goes. So another thing to keep in mind, because we all have other things going on. I've almost written off, the summer months to get things done on these projects. So what can we heavy up in the winter, et cetera. So that one, just to keep in mind when you're working on timelines. The other thing too, that I find, especially now in our COVID learning space, is we have, as we evidenced here, we have such power in the virtual space for outreach that pretty much any grant you look at, definitely Farmer Rancher, a piece of that is, how are you going to communicate what you're doing? How are you going to share your results, what you learn, these new resources? How are you going to do outreach and education? Okay, well, sure, partnering with organizations we're connected with helps, but using that virtual space, doing a webinar like this, or doing other ways to creatively get your resources out there, are so much more, I think, just efficient in the Zoom space now. Probably every Farmer Rancher grant should be doing some form of webinar on what they did, because that's the ultimate way to share it. Because again, with these types of projects, it's both, yes, what'll help you and your farm, but more importantly, how is what you're learning can help other farms. So on that note, Dan will probably talk more about this, but all of at least the SARE Farmer Rancher grants are available. All the SARE grants are in the project database online. So that's a great first step to just see what's already been done. You can see these ones I've been working on to both review the topic and also see if something's been done before, but don't write it off if something has generally been done before, because that's the whole idea too, that these grant ideas build on each other. So you'll see even in farmer rancher applications, there's a space for how are you building on other former research? So to have things that happened before, if you've got other ideas for cottage food, fantastic, use what we've done and build on it is the idea. But that is a great first step to see what's been out there already. So I want to just, I mentioned the farmer rancher, but also the youth educator grants. Those was my first entry into these SARE grants. So back in 2012, we, a group of women farmers by me here in Greene County, received one to do a farm tour. We wanted to, we live in a very conventional large-scale dairy area, and people just didn't know that these renegade or small or women-run organic farms were happening. So we had a public tour day to encourage younger women too to consider careers in agriculture. And that Soil Sisters Tour Day basically has evolved now to a full weekend event. It's its own project under Renewing the Countryside, and is one of the largest women farmer-led events in the country. I'm proud to say, and it all came from that youth educator grant. So it's something to think about, because all of us I know do a lot of education work. They're smaller grants, but they're designed for initiatives that help support sustainable ag education for youth. So those are unique, I believe, even to this area, north central of the United States. But those are something to think about too, and another portal within the SARE portfolio. And I will put in the chat this cottage food project I'm working on. We're doing a second round of recipes. So what I'm showing you is the first grant that ended right in March of 2020, as folks might recall. We didn't really get to do all the outreach events that we wanted around that. So we're back to add more recipes, and we'll be doing a webinar on helping support farmers to use their local, what they're raising in bakery goods probably in February. So stay tuned and please join us for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. You covered a tremendous amount of information in a very short period of time. So our next speaker is going to be Judy Clendenning. Does anybody, I see there are a few questions in the chat. I tried to answer a few of them as we went along. Maybe if people have someone has a very urgent question, you can ask it now. Otherwise, I'm going to ask Judy to start putting up her slides. And while she is doing that, I'm going to launch the first of our polls. We have to report on who attends our educational events. So if you don't mind taking a moment or two to put in your answer to this poll, that's very helpful to us. Thanks, everyone. You're doing great. I see more than half of you have already responded. All right. Well, thank you so much. Judy, do you want to go ahead? I'll leave the poll up for a minute or two, but folks can, if they've already taken it, you can minimize it on your page.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Judy Clendenning. I work for the USDA Rural Development, and I'm going to spend a little time talking about two programs that can actually help farmers directly. The first one is the Rural Energy for America program. That one does have a funding deadline that is coming up October 31st, but we also have another funding deadline that comes up March 31st. This one is one of the programs that does have set deadlines. So if you are looking about doing this type of project, you have time for the next round. All right, my slides don't seem to want to advance right now.
I was having problems with that too.
Yeah, either way.
Try persisting.
Okay. Yeah, it's like, hmm. Well, they are just not having anything to do with this. There it goes. Sorry about that. So the Rural Energy for America program, or REAP, is does guaranteed loan funding or grant funding for renewable energy systems or energy and efficiency projects. In order to be eligible for this program, you need to either be an agricultural producer, which we define as having 51% of your gross revenue coming from egg production, or to be a rural small business. We look at the NAICS code for the industry that you're in and compare it to the SBA size standard. And if you come in as a rural small business, you need to be located in a rural area, which is a community less than 50,000. In where this program has two sides to it, either energy efficiency or renewable energy. So if you're a farmer and you're looking at possibly replacing lighting in your barn or replacing an older grain dryer with a more efficient one, that would come in on that side of the program. Or if you want to do renewable energy, you could do solar power, wind, maybe some geothermal, anaerobic digesters. This grant can fund up to 25% of the eligible costs. The other costs would have to come from the applicant. Just a few things of some eligible project costs. This grant can actually purchase the new or refurbished equipment for the project, let's say solar panels, the grain dryer itself. As was mentioned earlier, all of the expenses need to be after the application, after we receive the application. Some of the important ineligible costs, this can't help with residential projects. So if you have a dairy farm and you're putting solar panels on, we couldn't help with the part of the energy that is going to go to the residents. We would have to figure out what part goes to the farm and what goes to the residents. And very important to note, if there's lease payments, we've seen some projects that have solar panels that are a lease to own. That would not be an eligible project cost because the actual applicant doesn't own the project. Then how to apply for this, you would want to talk to our rural energy coordinator, and that would be Brenda Heinen. But if you contact me, I will get you in contact with her, and it'd be best to do that as soon as possible so she can help you determine if you're eligible for this program and if your project's eligible. The next program I'm talking about is the Value Added Producer Grant. That gives funding for value added projects. There's two types of grants for this. One is a planning grant. Let's say you're a farmer and you want to look into the feasibility of going from just growing your tomatoes and selling them as a commodity to making spaghetti sauce. This could help pay for a qualified third party to do the feasibility study or marketing plan or business plan. There's also a working capital part of the project. If you were actually going to be making the tomato sauce, we could help you with that part of it, some of the expenses for that. Please note that this is not a job training program, and this particular grant cannot help people farm. It doesn't help with any of the egg production part of it. So it's a little different than some of the other programs. To be an eligible applicant, there are 4 different groups. If you're interested in doing this, you'd want to contact me and we could help you figure out what type of group you'd be in. One thing you really need to keep in mind is to be eligible, you must be what we call the egg producer, which is the actual person or entity raising the raw commodity. I've had a few calls where people have purchased farms in another state. They own the farm, they control what happens there, but they are not the actual person, as they say, swinging the gates, not the one planting the corn. They're not the one milking the cows. In our definition, they are not considered egg producers. They're more passive investors, so they wouldn't be eligible. They also need to produce more than 50% of the raw commodity going into the project. So let's say you wanted to do a cheese project. You can't be a farmer who owns 10 dairy cows, but you're going to purchase milk from about another 50 dairy cows and make the cheese. You'd have to have at least 50% of the milk going in being from your operation. You also need to be a citizen and have legal authority to run this type of business in your state. Project eligibility, we have different categories of projects. Most of ours come in as change in physical state, which would be going from the tomato to spaghetti sauce. We also have, you can come in for being produced in a manner that enhances value. We have a few projects that come in because they are produced, let's say, organically. We can also have physical segregation, farm ranch, renewable energy. We also have quite a few projects that come in as locally produced agricultural food product. These projects need to be projects that are, the food is sold within about 40 or about 400 miles of the farm. We also now can actually work with hemp related projects. That is just a newer thing. But in order to be eligible, the farmer needs to be licensed under the AMS licensing. Some eligible uses of planning grant funds, as I'd mentioned earlier, to do the feasibility study, business plan, or marketing plan from a third-party source. For eligible working capital, to pay costs of the processing of the raw commodity, we could help pay for the processing plant making your tomato sauce. We can do packaging, label, ingredients. One thing you need to keep in mind is when you're doing this type of project, you need to keep ownership of the project from beginning to end. You can't just drop your tomatoes off at the facility and then they take over ownership and they sell it. You actually need to be the one selling the product. Some ineligible uses, we can't do the egg production. We don't do buildings. We don't do infrastructure for this, that you'd have to go somewhere else for that type of funding. There are matching funds required in this program. So if you were going to do a project that was a $100,000 project, you'd have to come in with 50% of the project itself. And some of the matching funds could be some in-kind labor from the farmer, but there's a limit on how much that can be, and some other like raw commodity match, but you'd want to talk to me about how we can structure that. Grant period can be up to 36 months, depending on the size of the project you're doing. I have some that run about a year and some that run up to the whole 3 years. And very important, the tools for applying. On our website, we have toolkits for both the planning and the working capital grant. These toolkits are optional. They are not technically required, but going through the toolkit gets you to an application that is most likely complete. This program is very particular on if you don't have a complete application, you won't be considered for funding. So you really want to make sure you have a complete application. And there's some tools here. These slides will be available. Once again, contact me if you're interested in this, and be better just do it sooner than later. We're hoping to have a notice come out this late fall, early winter. I'm not sure exactly when. We normally have a 60 to 90 day application window, and you're going to need the whole 60 to 90 days. And if you need to do a feasibility study, you probably would have wanted to be working on that already. So it'd be best to contact me as soon as you can. And that is it.
Thank you, Judy. Super
Thank you.
to cover these programs in such a short amount of time. And if you look at the chat, you will find that people have a number of questions that I think you can answer best rather than some of the rest of us trying to get into trouble.
Okay, I will look at those and start answering. Thank you.
Do you want to stop share?
Yep. Where did I do that? There. Did it go now?
Yep, it did. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. And I will now try to quickly cover some information about the SARE programs. So what is SARE? I wind up always using the acronym. It stands for Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. It is a U.S. Department of Agriculture program. And one of the main things they do is offer grants to advance environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable agriculture. The SARE is divided into 4 regions across the US. And in this region, there are 6 grants that SARE offers. And the 2 that the one that I will be talking about most is Farmer Rancher. But if you are a graduate student or if you're interested in youth education. And Lisa mentioned how she used a youth educator grant to do, to start a really big project. Those are also other grants you might want to look into. If you have questions about some of these other grants, let me know. Partnership grant is one where an organization partners with 3 or more farmers. So if you know a couple of other farmers and you have an idea, and the 3 or more of you can get together and convince an organization, that's another grant route to follow. What is sustainable agriculture? What kinds of grants do they cover? Lisa mentioned that SARE has a database of all the grants they've ever funded. And so you can get an idea, a really good idea there. But here we have a list of the kinds of things that SARE has funded. And this is by no means complete, but it's intended to let you know that it's everything from production details like sustainable weed management to kind of community development projects, to marketing, things that have to do with livestock. So lots of different things. So I'm going to dive into the Farmer Rancher Grant Program. These are grants for farmers. So you have to be a farmer to apply for these grants. And they can either be research focused or they can be education focused. So as Lisa said, particularly the research focused ones, if there's a problem that you're passionate about, finding a solution to, and it's likely that that's going to be a problem that other farmers are facing as well. So that's the kind of the thing and then that's their first question in the application is what is the problem that you're trying to solve? And also it's important to understand how SARE defines farmer, very different from the program that Judy just mentioned. If you are growing agricultural products, especially if you're growing them for sale, then SARE considers you to be a farmer. But in some cases, SARE might consider you to be a farmer, even if you're not growing them for sale. I think the key thing is it's not just being used internally in your household. If you're growing them as part of a community effort or something like that, and they don't have a minimum, there's no minimum gross income, there's no minimum acreage size. So if you're growing agricultural products, and especially if you're selling any of them, SARE would consider you to be a farmer. The grants are for the Farmer Rancher grants. You can apply for up to $15,000 for an individual farm, and up to $30,000 for a project where 2 or more farms are working together. As Lisa mentioned, partnerships really make the projects, that make the grant applications stronger. Partly it proves that other people are facing the same, kinds of problems. And also partly it shows that you have those connections so that the worthwhile things you find out through the project will be shared with other farmers. The deadline for this year's Farmer Rancher grants is December 1st. So here again is just, and this is just a small selection of grants that were funded in the last couple of years in Wisconsin. So everything from kind of perfecting a fencing system for pastured poultry, to using compost tea and organic vegetable and fruit production, to mushroom production, to experimenting with drones to improve grazing management. And, as you heard from Lisa, there's also the value added side of the farming enterprise that has been funded. If you want more information, and especially if you if you contact me early, you are welcome to contact me and I will follow up with an email to all the registrants, and I will put contact information for people in that email as well. So if you don't capture all the little links in the chat, you will be getting a follow-up email. You are welcome to ask me questions about your Farmer Rancher grant. You can also contact the regional office at SARE, and their information is here. And I think that is all my slides for now. And I will pass it to our next speaker. And I think that is Dana.
Sounds good. Is that showing up?
We're seeing it, but we're seeing the view with all the slides on the left.
Okay. How's that?
That's great.
Okay, great. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dana Crystal. I am the program manager for the Producer-Led Watershed Protection Grants Program, which is what I'll be talking about today. So just a brief overview of the Producer-Led program. The main goal of this program is to support farmer-driven local efforts that address water quality improvement. For our program, we have a max available of $1 million each year. In terms of timeline, our request for proposals goes out early July each year, and then our applications are typically due sometime in mid-September. Our applicants are scored on a couple of different metrics, but really the review team looks at the viability of their work plan, their anticipated outcomes towards soil health and water quality improvement. We look at their communications plan, and then we really want to see evidence of farmer commitment and evidence that the project is really farmer driven. We do score existing groups a little bit differently than new groups. We have slightly different ranking criteria for groups that are less than 2 years old. We place more emphasis on their work planning and the farmer commitment. And then existing groups, we look more at past performance and also farmer commitment, but also look at kind of how they're innovating and growing. So briefly, requirements. We need at least 5 producers in the watershed project area that are applying as a group. Each group needs to collaborate with a collaborating entity, and they need to develop a memorandum of understanding with their collaborators. So that can be UW Extension, a county land conservation department, DNR, or a conservation or farmer nonprofit. Requests can't exceed $40,000 per year, but a group can come back each year to apply each year. And then we do require 1-to-1 match, but up to 50% of that match can be in kind. So just a brief snapshot of how the program has grown over time. We started out with about $250,000 in our budget, and it's again grown to $1 million. Started out with 14 groups, and last year we awarded 36. And this year was our highest year yet of 45 requests. So we're currently in the application review period, and 2023 will be announced within the next month. I mentioned, the main premise of the program is, we look at is the farmer-led group identifying the resource concern in their watershed, and then how are they planning to address that resource concern. So a lot of groups will use program funding to incentivize different conservation practices on farms in both within the membership and then just throughout the watershed. So we have a lot of groups that are incentivizing cover crops, so whether that's a single species cover crop, multi-species cover crops, incentivizing different ways of establishing cover crops like interseeding, We have groups that are incentivizing composting on the farm, different rotational grazing practices. And then we also have some groups that are doing things like organizing aerial seeding programs for cover crops. So trying to cut down the cost of aerial seeding and organizing that throughout the whole watershed. So it's pretty flexible in terms of the different types of conservation practices that we will fund. We've moved away from funding a lot of like structural engineered practices. Most groups are really focused on more cropland practices. So then we have a lot of groups that are really focused on education and outreach too. So our groups put on a lot of different field days. This is a field day from our group called the Sheboygan River Progressive Farmers. They partnered with Between the Lakes Demonstration Farms Network, where they brought in different specialists, speakers to highlight a demonstration farm. Here's a photo of a field day from the Uplands Watershed Group in Iowa County, where it's a goat silvopasture field day, touring a farm that recently set up a silvopasture system. This is a photo from our group, the Milwaukee River Clean Farm Families. They're touring field day participants around at a long-term demonstration site that's comparing soil health system, more of a conventional system. And again, this is all kind of farmer planned. A lot of farmers attend these, as well as different conservation professionals. But it's a really key way that a lot of our groups get their message out, promote their different incentive programs, and promote their message about water quality in their watershed. This is an example of a group working with a school group. So this is the Farmers for Upper Sugar River. They partnered with the UW-Madison People Program, which is a program for potential first-generation college students. And so they reached out to this particular farmer-led group in regards to their environmental and ag curriculum. And so they spent the day on one of the farmer-led group's farms, just touring the farm. And for many, it was one of their first days ever on a farm. So in addition to other types of youth education, we have one of our groups, the Farmers of Mill Creek. They work a lot with like elementary age kids, teaching them not only about agriculture, but conservation in agriculture. So again, bringing out school groups to member farms. We have some groups that do trial out different closing meals for no-till drills. This is another example of a farmer-led group that's working with their county. I believe their county actually owns this roller crimper, and then the farmer-led group works with the county to rent out the roller crimper to trial it on different member farms. So it's a way to trial out a different piece of equipment without making that capital investment on their own. A lot of groups will also use funds for on-farm research and demonstrations. So this is an example of the Sauk Soil and Water Improvement Group. They're doing a mob grazing study, among other types of grazing studies here, working with different partners to gather data and look at results, and again, share that with other farmers in the community. This is an example of a demonstration put on by the group called Biological Farming Friends in Madison area. They are really trying to nail down interseeding in corn. So this is a demonstration of that early in the field season last year. And this is another example of a demonstration, again, with the Sheboygan River Progressive Farmers up in Sheboygan County, looking at some different cover crop mixes used for feed for a dairy operation. So now, in our program in recent years, we've had 16 on-farm demonstrations and 10 official research studies. Again, it's just a way for a lot of these groups to share the message that they're trying to promote in their watershed. And then groups will also use funds for on-farm assessments or different watershed assessments to gather like baseline data. So that can be well tests, stream sampling, different types of soil tests. And so that kind of concludes how the groups use the funds. We do have a list of things that are ineligible, but we kind of deal with that in our request for proposals each year. And most of the time before a group applies, they generally connect with one of us StatCap staff so we can kind of step them through the process. So always happy to take questions, phone calls from folks. My contact information is there.
Thank you, Dana. And yes, your contact information should also be on the sort of summary matrix, and I posted a link to that in the chat. I'll post another one, and I will also include that in the follow-up information I send out. Ryan, I think you are our final grant speaker. I do want to, while you're transitioning and pulling up your slides, want to emphasize one of the things that Judy and Dana touched on. One of the other things to consider when you're applying for a grant, each grant has its set of instructions, and different grant programs give them different names. So it's called the request for proposals, or the call for proposals, or the notice of funding availability. But that's where you find the information about who's an eligible applicant, and very critically, the information about what costs that program will fund and what costs it won't fund. And one thing that I think all of us who work with grant programs spend a fair bit of time doing is explaining to people that typically grant programs won't help with major capital expenses. There are some exceptions, but most of them won't help you buy land and won't help you do things like buy major equipment. Ryan, I'll stop using up your speaking time and let you take it from here.
All right, sounds good, Diane. Thanks so much for putting this on, and really a lot of great information here that applies to a lot of different grant programs. But I will be talking about a couple of different grant programs here within the Division of Agricultural Development. I've got a few different programs I administer, but the ones I want to highlight today are our Buy Local, Buy Wisconsin grant and our Specialty Crop Block grant. Buy Local, Buy Wisconsin is a state-funded grant, and Specialty Crop is funded through USDA and AMS. Getting right into the Buy Local, Buy Wisconsin, it was a program which was launched in 2008. It's an economic development program which is designed to help Wisconsin ag and food industry find ways to improve food production, processing, marketing, and distribution with the hopes of expanding Wisconsin's local food system. It is a competitive grant program. We have $200,000 to give out on an annual basis. Awards range from $5,000 to $50,000. We award grants to individuals, groups, businesses, or organizations. Projects create, expand, diversify, or promote any of the following: local food marketing systems and market outlets, local food and cultural tourism routes, production, processing, marketing, and distribution of Wisconsin food products, primarily for sale to local purchasers. What is to note here, it's an economic development grant. It's focusing on increasing Wisconsin local food purchases and sales. Like Diane has mentioned about a lot of the other programs here, but this one is no exception. It's a reimbursement-based grant, and funds are not given up front. Grantees must prove funds have been spent in accordance with the approved application prior to being reimbursed. We do not fund feasibility projects or startups. Thus, applicants must submit sales figures for previous 24 months or profit and loss statements from the past 2 years. Here's just a little bit of the application history from the last 4 years. Last year, we set a record number of applicants as well as the total amount applied for. We were able to fund 12 of these 60 projects. In 2019 and 2022, we had $200,000 to award. In 2020 and in 2021, we had $300,000 to award. In terms of the timeline, we'll be releasing the RFA and the application packet in January. Proposals will be due in March. Mid to late April, applicants will be notified, and projects should begin in June. I'd check our website for specific dates, but that's right now what we've got penciled in. In terms of eligibility requirements, it's a 1-to-1 match, so grant recipient must match equal or a greater amount. So if you've got a $20,000 grant, you must match $20,000. You have a 2-year window to complete the projects. There is an additional year which is available upon request. It's at the discretion of DADCAP to grant that request or not. You are not eligible if you've received a buy local grant within the last 4 years, or if you have an open specialty crop block grant or a dairy processor grant. What to keep in mind when applying: have someone look it over. Okay, if it's a UWA extension agent, educator, Diane's mentioned Michael Fields, just someone to check out your application. Use an outline to help you organize. Use the scoring criteria which is listed in the RFA, and focus on project tasks and results, not necessarily your personal philosophy or your opinions. I'd also mention a trickle-down benefit here. If your project can impact numerous markets or entities, that'll go a long way in making your proposal stand out. And just remember that the goal for all projects must be to increase local food sales in the state. Once you've received a grant, the expectations are that you'll get a contract. Funding commitments aren't final until both parties have signed the contract, and projects may not begin until we have signed and returned the contract. In terms of payments or reimbursements, there must be at least 2 throughout the year. One large reimbursement at the end of the project isn't allowed, and expense must take place within the contract dates. We do hold 25% of the total grant funds until a final report is submitted. There are 2 semi-annual reports due throughout the year. It needs to highlight activities performed or performance goals achieved during the reporting period. And then the final report describes the original intent of the project, its benefits, as well as a quantitative summary. Here's just a quick glimpse at some of the recipients we've funded in the last couple of years: Manitowoc Area Visitor and Convention Bureau for the Wisconsin Coastal Food Trail, Verona Area Chamber of Commerce for their downtown farmers market, Blue Moon Community Farm, expanding access and increasing local purchasing of vegetables, Vesperman Farms. They hired a consultant for branding strategy, logo work, package design, advertising, and video audio work. In terms of applying, again, we'll be releasing everything in January. Check out our website or get in touch with me. So that is about it for Buy Local, Buy Wisconsin. I'll get into specialty crop here real quick. What is a specialty crop? They're defined by the USDA as fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, dried fruits, horticulture, and nursery crops, which includes floriculture. Must be for human consumption or aesthetics. For a comprehensive list, you would want to check out the website. There's quite a few on there, and there's going to be quite a few ineligible specialty crops as well. The purpose of the grant is to solely enhance the competitiveness of Wisconsin's specialty crop industries. In terms of funding priorities, we've got a few that we list each year. Education for producers, processors, and the general public to increase production, sales, or consumption of Wisconsin specialty crops. Industry innovation and production, processing, and packaging, increasing the demand for and supply of Wisconsin specialty crops. Development of food safety practices and environmental sustainability, pest and disease control, and varietal improvement. Here's a little quick glimpse at the application history here as well. What is important to note is that the funding depends entirely upon USDA and the percentage our state receives. In terms of timeline, we'll be releasing the RFA in December of this year, which is a little earlier than past years. Applications will be due in February. We'll notify applicants roughly in April, perhaps March. We need to submit our entire state application to the USDA in May. That's kind of why we had to move things up. That was earlier this year than we were accustomed to. So we want to get those in on time. USDA reviews and approves everything throughout the summer. There's some jockeying back and forth there where I might contact a subawardee or a grantee and ask for, and USDA wants some follow-up on an application. Projects begin roughly November, December. Okay, in terms of being eligible, must solely enhance the competitiveness of specialty crops. That's your main goal there. Cannot benefit a single organization, institution, or individual program. Okay, so it won't fund a project to start or expand a farm or business venture. Entities include nonprofit and for-profit entities, universities, local, state, and federal governments. In terms of the project itself, they last for 3 years. Applications which build on previously funded specialty crop projects are allowed. Applicants can submit more than one application. Priority is given to projects which have the potential to provide solutions that lead to measurable benefits to specialty crop growers and consumers. The measurable part is underlined there for a reason. We want to be able to actually measure what we are. We're increasing, hopefully. It's a reimbursement-based grant. There is no match required for this one. Funding amounts for our state are a minimum of $10,000 and maximum of $100,000. In terms of eligible expenses and allowable costs, salaries, wages, and fringe benefits, consultant services and subcontractors, materials and supplies, travel, equipment lease or rental, and other miscellaneous costs, including but not limited to printing, meetings, publications, and postage. Supplies are defined as items with an individual cost of less than $5,000 or a depreciation of less than 1 year. In terms of how to apply, again, the RFA is going to be coming out in December. You can check our website or get in touch with me. And that is all I have. And thanks for coming on. And please feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions. Diane, back to you.
Well, thank you to all our speakers for amazingly staying on time. This has been a fire hose of information, and I know some of the questions have been answered in the chat, but I also know it's possible some people may want to ask questions verbally. So at this point, that is all right. I also am going to launch another little poll to help us both understand whether this webinar was helpful, but also we have a question about whether people would be interested in attending an in-person workshop that would really be more of a grants workshop. We would have a little more in-depth information on how to design a project, but it would be followed by some time for people to actually put pen to paper, start writing down your ideas and workshop them, have someone else look at them that's just another attendee of the workshop, or have one of the grant program representatives look at that. So I'm going to launch this poll. If people have comments, not the right poll. They can also just follow up with me later. Aha, here we go. If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, there is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little smiley face that says reactions. And I believe if you press on that, it will allow you to raise your hand, and then we'll call on you to unmute yourself. Well, thank you everyone for answering the poll. I am going to kick things off. I'm going to ask a question of both, well, of all three of our other presenters. If the grant program has not yet, if this current request for applications or whatever your program calls it has not yet been released, is it possible for viewers to find an old one and look at it and start thinking about how they might frame their project before the official announcement for this coming year comes out?
Yeah, that's certainly something that we do here, and that's something that I urge people that are thinking about applying for the next year goes. Just check out last year's RFA, last year's application, because certainly in my experience, they don't change too much. But yes, those are online on our website, and if they're not, get in touch with me and I will be happy to share them with you.
Thanks, Ryan. Dana and Judy?
This is Judy. So the Rural Energy for America program application, the deadline is coming up, but we accept applications for that program year round. So at any time you can go on our website, pull down the application materials and start the process, call our energy coordinator. I would always suggest calling the energy coordinator ahead of time, because then she can help walk you through if you're eligible. Sometimes it saves you time. Our value added producer grant is not currently open, but we do have the toolkits from last year available on the website. And I tell everybody I talk to, go look at that toolkit. It doesn't change a whole lot each year. It's a big application. There's no reason to not start that process ahead of time. And by the time the request comes out, you have half of the work done. And if you need to have a feasibility study, you've already started that process. And I am willing to work with anybody who wants to start that process right now. I'd love to talk about this program. So give me a call and we can help determine if you're eligible and get you started on the right track, because might as well have it halfway done by the time the notice comes out. And Diane, thank you for doing this so I can let people know this is available.
Great. Dana, how about with the producer-led watershed grants?
Yeah, so we're no longer accepting applications for 2023 funding. Our funding application cycle usually closes in mid-September. But in terms of new groups applying, typically groups can start work planning and looking at old RFPs in the spring already, because it can take a little bit of time to organize. And they're always welcome to reach out to me or other DATCAP staff to assist with that. So.
All right, other questions or other comments? We still have quite a few people on, so Margaret, please go ahead.
If somebody wanted to get access to purchase land or purchase equipment, or if they wanted to undertake a conservation practice that might not be covered, say, by SARE, what might they do?
Thank you, Margaret. I know you know the answer to that question as well as I do, but it is a good question to ask. So, and I will ask all of our other speakers or other people to weigh in. Kind of the way I think about it is that grant programs are designed to let people do things that we don't really know how to do. And for things like buying land or equipment, there the approach is typically to go through a conventional loan program. And that can either be a regular bank or the US Department of Agriculture Farm Service Agency offers loans specifically to farmers for farm loans. And they do have a variety of different loan programs for different groups of farmers. So they have micro loan programs. They have loan programs that are specially for beginning farmers. They have loan programs for farmers that belong to groups that the U.S. Department of Agriculture recognizes that it has in the past not served well, which they call socially disadvantaged farmers. There's also a farm credit system, and there are several banks covering, or several lending institutions covering different parts of the state. So that would be where I would go with that, with ideas for purchasing land or equipment. Then there is another USDA agency who we don't have on today just because of limited time, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And they have a whole suite of conservation, of sort of recognized, established conservation practices that they fund. So that's different from exploring a conservation practice that we don't necessarily really know how to do yet. These are practices where the agency has come up with some specific guidelines for how to do it. And that's called the EQIP program, the Environmental Quality Improvement Program. And they also have another program called Conservation Stewardship that recognizes farms that are already going beyond the basics for conservation. And they have what they call enhancements, so different things that they can help pay farmers for. As I said, Margaret actually knows these details at least as well as I do, so I will invite her or anyone else to step in and elaborate.
Hey, Dan, I just want to add, and I'll put it in the chat, there is a fairly newer project, Renewing the Countryside and Marble Seed are some partners, called the Farm Access Hub, and this provides additional resources for folks looking to access land, and there's specifically navigators who are trained in Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin to help with that. So I'll put it in the chat, another resource.
Thank you, Lisa. That's great. Thanks for, I'm sorry, I forgot.
I'm Jean Northey. I don't know if you hear me. I have a, okay, great. I have a question. I'm in the southwest region of the state with family-owned land, but I'm interested in fibers, and that's kind of experimental with what might be a fiber used, a crop that would be used for fiber, say flax or hemp actually too. And I know I heard that Judy talked about hemp being licensing by AMS, which I wasn't sure who that was. Now I know it's changed from previous, but so if you could, which would be a good direction for me to get some grant money for, not necessarily machinery or the land, but probably seed and cost sharing, and maybe infrastructure for water, watering systems and stuff like that. I'm not sure which group would fit in my particulars there.
Well, I'll start, and then I will invite the other panelists to jump in. SARE has funded research projects. There's one in particular that looked at, I don't remember the specifics, but I believe it was different flax processing options. So again, that would be something you could look at the SARE database, and I would enter flax, and I would enter hemp, and I would enter fiber, and just see what pops up across the country. Again, they are, seed would be considered supplies, so it would, that would be an allowable budget item, as well as your time. You would have to show that connects to whatever research question you're answering, right? So an open-ended research question like, can I make this work for my farm?
Yeah.
Is probably not as fundable, but you can basically take that question and say, I want to test the economics of two different fiber crops, and so I will track my labor, I will track this, and I will look at yield or something like that. You could do something like that. You could also frame a more narrow question, like, I want to compare different planting times if these are crops that we don't know a lot about, or what makes a hemp crop a good fiber thing? You know,
Right, yeah.
USDA was slow to want to do anything with hemp, but SARE has funded a couple of hemp projects. So I don't off the top of my head know what their current requirements are, but you know, if you have questions about that, you can reach out to me or the regional coordinator for the program, Joan Benjamin. And I would start by reading the call for proposals through and see what it says.
Okay.
And Judy's put the agricultural marketing service link for hemp into the website.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question, but that's
No, yeah, it does. Yeah, that's a good start. One of the just the preliminary things I've heard is flax takes a 5 to 6 year crop rotation, which seems very extreme. So I would think that there would be interest in trying to shorten those lengths of time, like with augmenting with another companion plant or under seeding or something like that. Just again, also about the watering systems, does SARE cover that type of thing? Like if you had to do any watering irrigation or anything?
I'm not 100% confident, but my concern is that might be viewed as equipment.
Okay.
If the equipment is necessary for the project, SARE will fund up to 50%. Now, unlike many of these other programs, SARE doesn't require a match, but it does require this 50% match for equipment.
Okay. Okay.
And yeah, irrigation is interesting because often SARE's solution is to say rent the stuff, but renting irrigation is probably, because the installation is a lot of the cost as opposed to the equipment per se. That might be a follow-up individually question.
Thank you so much. Your efforts have been really great today. Thank you.
And Ryan, I will ask you this. I'm guessing that hemp is not considered a specialty crop. Ryan, if you're still here, you're muted. I'm not hearing your answer. You are here. I'm not sure if Ryan is having internet connectivity issues or has stepped. Any other questions? You can just, to unmute yourself, there's a little microphone icon on the bottom left of your screen. And if you click on that, it should unmute you. So at this point, I think I'll just open it up, and if everyone talks at once, I'll put in a system.
I'll make just the point that there have been a lot of links that have been put into the chat here. And when you send around the link for the webinar, it might be a good idea if you could send along the chat, just because there's a lot of information that people might wish to go back and reference later.
Thank you, Margaret. That's a good suggestion. I will try to do that, because unfortunately the recording never captures the chat. Well, I'll give it another 2 or 3 minutes. If someone put a question in the chat and it has not been adequately answered, maybe take this time to unmute yourself and ask the group.
I don't have a question, but I do want to go back to the thing I said at the very beginning, or I put into the chat at the beginning, which is Michael Fields Ag Institute has a service offering free grants advising. We don't write people's grant proposals for them, but we help them every step of the way, figuring out what it is, helping you to refine what it is that you're trying to do, helping you think through what programs might make sense. And then if you really decide you're going to apply, help you decide which program you're going to apply to, or potentially programs. And then think through your talking points, your process for developing your proposal, and our grants advisors will review what you've written and help guide you. And then if in fact you get the grant, help you consider how to set up a system to make sure you get done the things you intend to do. And also will assist you if you don't get funded, and thinking through what the process is for making sure you get feedback. Often it comes, doesn't always. And then what next? So that's something that you could remember. Maybe I'll just quickly put that back in, since maybe people came in after that was, I put it in at the front. I'll just stick that link back in here. We really do want to make sure that nobody fails to use federal resources for lack of confidence. And if you're feeling a little weak in the knees about going forward, that's our goal, is to be there to help.
Thank you, Margaret. Really good. And there's really good resources there as well. There are recordings of longer webinars Margaret has done about how to design a project and how to apply for a grant. We are also thinking of recording another webinar with Margaret, and we will let you know if we do that. Yes, that's very helpful information there.
Margaret, this is Judy from Rural Development. Do you ever give people guidance on where to go to get feasibility studies? That's one of the big questions we get, and we try to send them out to as many people as we can find. But is that one of the services you provide? I know not doing the feasibility study, but sending them to reputable people who can do it. Is that part of what you do?
It is not. However, it's
Okay.
a really good point. I love that you asked it. And it's the point that our goal is to try to help people. So if that's a thing that we ought to do, let's talk about it. I actually often refer people to your website for this purpose. Usually I say to people, it's not uncommon in such workshops for somebody to say, would it make sense to hire somebody to do my grant proposal? And I usually say, you will be by far the best person, even if you are insecure about your writing. You will do a better job because you know its details, and as Lisa said, you got the passion.
Right.
And you can kind of connect the dots better than anyone else can, with the exception of the value-added producer grant program. It's the one where it's a pretty complex booger. And I think it's a good idea to say that, out loud, and help people find help if they look at it and go, oops, I could use some help. And you all have on your website, you have a list of folks who really do help in writing VAPG grants. So I like that we're doing it collectively. Let's talk, and we can offer that resource and put it on our website.
Okay.
Delighted to do it.
Thank you, because I know we have a few entities that we have that some entities do it for free or a low cost, but any more resources we can get to people, because once it gets down to the last month or two, people are scrambling to find someone to do a feasibility study, and they're not a short process. We've had people say, I want to get one done, and all the people say they don't have time, and it's still 2 months. And I'm like, it's going to take more than 2 months to do it. And it's frustrating. So any contacts you would have to share would be great, because we're always trying to link people with someone that can help them.
Let's chat.
Thanks.
I want to, I see a question or a comment in the chat from Jude Waite, and Jude, do you want to elaborate on that? Because I'm not sure if it's advising people to look for beginning farmer and rancher resources, or a question on how to find them. So if you don't mind unmuting yourself and clarifying, that would be super helpful.
I just got an email from our local rural development person. I'm in Washington, and she sent me those documents, but I don't know how, I don't have a link to them, and I couldn't upload them to the chat. But one of them is called BFR Resources 2021, and it has a lot of the stuff you're putting out, and the other is a matrix of all the rural development programs.
All right, thank you. I will connect with Judy and see if she has a link that I should include in the follow-up.
Well, I can forward it to your email, I guess.
Oh, that would be super. Thank you.
Yeah, and on the conversation you were just having, I just wonder if there's also, grant writers, but business plan or feasibility study people, in different regions, there are people that have worked with farmers, and so, have that experience. And I don't know whether there's any kind of, directory on any level, local, regional, or statewide or whatever, but that's an idea.
Really good point. I used to do that. I used to have that was not an uncommon request. And I did have a few folks that I would send folks to, but it's outdated. And I appreciate the thought to refresh that resource. Let's take it on.
Thank you, Margaret. It's always difficult for those of us who work for a public entity to make recommendations about specific individuals. So great to have Michael Fields take that on. And, I just want to, in the last couple of minutes, emphasize something that Margaret always emphasizes and that we haven't fully covered today, but that you don't get every grant you apply for. Sometimes you're lucky and get the first one. But if you apply for a grant and don't get it, that doesn't mean you aren't capable of doing it. It is really important to recognize that even people who are experienced grant writers don't get all the ones that they apply for, and that being turned down for a grant doesn't necessarily mean that your idea was a bad one. And you might just have to either resubmit it to the same group with a few tweaks based on the feedback you got, or look for another funder who might be more closely aligned to your idea. And people alluded to, if you get turned down, you normally will be given some information about why you were turned down. If you were not given that information, it is absolutely your right to contact the program and say, can you help me understand why my grant wasn't funded? And that information can be very helpful in understanding whether it's because the grant program just doesn't think it fits with their mission, or whether it's, a specific thing about how you put the grant together that you could fix. And sometimes it may be something that you just disagree and you wouldn't want to change. But in many, many cases, it's a small thing that you can fix for the next time. All right, well, I really want to thank all our presenters. I want to thank all the participants who've stayed. I think I will stop the recording and close the meeting if I don't hear any other questions.